Hey, Alaska photographer Jeff Schultz here, and today I want to give you my 5 top tips about doing aerial photography from either an airplane or a helicopter. I do an awful lot of aerial photography in my work, and I've learned a number of lessons over the years. Follow me as I show you a couple different things here. So before you get going, ask the pilot which side of the airplane you should be on, and base that off of looking at a map of their route. Oftentimes they take the same route. So if the best stuff is going to be on the right-hand side, you should be on the right-hand side, and vice versa. If the best stuff is going to be on the left-hand side, you want to be on the left-hand side. So one of the first things you want to do is be sure you talk to your pilot ahead of time and make sure that you have a window seat in the airplane. A lot of different airplane configurations. Some have 3 people across, some have just 2. So anyway, just make sure that you have a window seat, and ideally your window would actually open all the way up. That would be in the ideal world, and usually that only happens on the right hand side of the airplane next to the pilot. Typically other parts of the airplane you don't have an opportunity to open the window. But then it's a matter of, do you want to be in the front seat or the back seat? Many people want to be in the front seat. To me, the only reason to be in the front seat is if you can literally open the window. Because if you can't open the window, look what you have as a problem in the front seat. You have that strut right there. Now, you have the option, you can shoot between the strut, something like that, but it's a very narrow window. Or you can shoot behind the strut, and that too is somewhat of a narrow window. So for when I do fly, I do a lot of flying in the front seat, and oftentimes I'm shooting out the back here. Notice where the wing is also. Oftentimes I'll ask the pilot to lift the wing up. But if you were to sit in the back seat, look at, there's no strut in the way at all. So sitting in the back seat to me is one of the best spots you can be. And especially if you're in a different kind of airplane like a Beaver, you can get well behind the wing if you're in a Beaver. So you don't have any issues at all looking out. So if the windows don't open in an airplane, get in the very back of the airplane. But again, on the side that the pilot suggests you get on. So more often than not, I suggest that you sit in the back of the airplane. 2 reasons. One is oftentimes there's not people sitting in the way back of an airplane, especially a Beaver. So you can actually shoot out one side and the other. So it doesn't matter what side you're on. But more importantly is the strut is not in the way when you're sitting in the back. You totally eliminate the idea of the strut, which is fantastic.
You can open that up whenever you want. A little bit.
But if you are in a plane and can open the window all the way, be sure you know how to operate it. Ask the pilot. Aircraft parts are really expensive. Be sure not to let the window fly out of your hand, as it will slam up against the wing. That's a big no-no. More often than not, as long as the pilot is not making a turn, the window will stay up while you're flying, giving you room to compose your image. But note that it may flop down at times, but certainly won't hurt you. And if you're flying in a helicopter, ideally, you'd be able to ask the pilot if you could have the door off. It's not something they do with just everybody, but you'll definitely have a huge advantage with a wide and tall, unobstructed view to shoot all angles by shooting with the door off. So no matter whether you can open the window or not, be sure you have flat windows on the airplane like this. Ask them ahead of time. As opposed to a bubble window like this. You really don't want to be in an airplane with a bubble window for 2 reasons. One is that the window does not open, literally cannot open all the way. And number 2, because it's concave or convex, it will distort the image if you're trying to shoot through the actual window. If you are forced to shoot through the plexiglass window, at least be sure it's clean, outside and in, before flight. Don't be embarrassed to ask your pilot to do that for you. Pilots do not want you to clean the plexi because plexiglass scratches very easy. While shooting through plexi will not produce images as sharp and crisp as an open window, don't be totally bummed. Oftentimes I am forced to shoot through the plexi. These are some of those images. My experience is that many times there is little degradation of the sharpness of the image. It just depends on a combination of how clear and clean the plexiglass you're shooting through is your focal length, any sun flare hitting your lens, but most especially if there are reflections. Reflections are the biggest problem when shooting through plexiglass and very hard, if not impossible, to overcome in post-processing. When you're shooting, it's very easy to overlook even seeing these reflections with your attention being focused on your subject out the window. So, if you're shooting through a window, be very conscientious when you're composing and look really close at the edges and corners for any off-color cast or something brighter than it should be. So, as I'm in here, I can see a reflection on the left-hand side. So you have two options. One is you can wear dark clothing, which helps. But the best thing to actually use is one of these rubber hoods. These are really an ingenious method to get rid of reflections. So what you do is you just get really close up and you hold it and then you eliminate that reflection. These anti-reflection hoods are really a great asset for both aerial photography and any time you have to shoot through glass. They are cheap, around 20 bucks, and small and lightweight so they can be taken anywhere. See the links I have to two of these in the notes below and a link to my short review comparing both of these hoods as well as I show how to use them. As far as the equipment that I use, I keep it simple. In aerial photography, it's all about the lens. My go-to lens is a 24 to 105 millimeter. It allows for great flexibility. And on a sunny day, I'll typically have a polarizer filter on the lens. On a second body, I'll have a 70 to 200 millimeter lens, but I use it much less frequently. So I want to tell you a little bit about the camera settings that I use almost all the time when I'm shooting aerials. So I'm typically in manual exposure mode or in time value / shutter priority. And also, I'm at a fast shutter speed, probably a 2,000th of a second if I'm in a helicopter where it's vibrating, or a 1,000th of a second. And then I'm at usually f4 or f5.6, thereabouts. Typically not wide open, but something similar. You don't need any depth of field because everything's on infinity, right? So you can shoot wide open even if you wanted to. Whatever your lens works best at. And then the ISO, actually I put ISO on auto. I put the ISO on auto so the camera makes that decision for me based on the shutter speed and the aperture. But then I also make sure the image stabilization is off. And the reason image stabilization is off is because if the window is open, then the wind coming across the lens will make the lens just go nuts, make the gyros go absolutely crazy. So turn the image stabilization off if the window is open or the door's off of the helicopter. Then I'm always using auto exposure bracketing. So the reason for using auto exposure bracketing is because you only get one chance at this aerial photography stuff. So if I use auto exposure bracketing, so where I'll shoot an image that is 2/3 of a stop underexposed, a second image that is on the money or normal exposure, and an image that is 2/3 of a stop overexposed. And that's because if I'm shooting a picture of snow, I want the camera to overexpose it slightly. And if I'm shooting a picture of gray granite rock or something, then I want the camera to do a normal exposure. I do the underexposure more often than not because if the sun, if I'm shooting into the sun, oftentimes I want to underexpose that. And to be clear, I use auto exposure bracketing because on many of the flights I'm on, the subject changes from white to normal to backlit sun at the drop of a hat. By shooting 3 frames of each composition at the 3 different exposures, the bracketing allows me to always be ready for any change of subject exposure. But I'll only use or keep the very best exposure of the 3. I'm not combining the 3 exposures. What is the very best exposure, you ask? Well, I'm always judging the best exposure based solely on the histogram, in combination of the subject matter at hand. Unless it's nighttime photography or something very unusual, the very best exposure for me is where the histogram shows that the exposure is to the right, meaning the histogram is as far to the right as possible without overexposing the highlights. For this image, based on the histogram, the frame on the upper left is the one I'll keep and process. This will be the exposure that has the most data to work with and the one that I will end up processing to look its very best. And it's an image like this one with blacks, whites, midtones, and all in sun and all in shadow. That is the reason that I auto exposure bracket. There's no way in the world I'm going to find the proper exposure in that instant of a second as the airplane or helicopter goes flying by. But by auto exposure bracketing, one of my 3 shots will be at the proper exposure. So as I said previously, shoot lots because you only get 1 chance at this. So shooting lots means shoot as many frames per second as your camera allows. The plane or helicopter is flying pretty fast, so subjects that are near the aircraft will change fast. And by using auto exposure bracketing, you'll be shooting 3 frames of each composition, so that's another reason to shoot as many frames per second as you can. And you'll have that many more compositions to choose from. Speaking of composition, don't get totally wound up about perfect compositions when doing aerials. Just make sure you get good and sharp images. You can always crop later in post-processing. Now, if the window is open or door off the helicopter, be sure not to put the lens out the window or into the fast-moving air. This makes the camera vibrate way too much. Now, also, before you go up, have a full battery and an empty media card. That's a big deal because you'll be shooting 3 frames per second using auto exposure bracketing of every image. Your battery and your card will be used up that much faster. And just as important, things will be happening too fast and you won't want to take the time to change either the battery or the card in flight. That said though, keep a spare battery and card handy in your pocket. So let's talk a little bit about making unique images from the air. I mean, as fun, cool, and as amazing as it is, consider not always shooting with the horizon in the frame. Look at the patterns below you. From up high, the geometric designs oftentimes create a very distinctive and exceptional photographic art. And keep your head on a swivel and look for it all. I consider being in the air with my camera a privilege and a very special opportunity with the most unusual view of the world that not many people get to even see, let alone photograph. It's a privilege for me to share these images with viewers around the world. Now, another cool thing, if there is any chance your pilot knows another pilot with an airplane, photographing air-to-air photos is absolute opportunity for stunning images. Some of my most unique images are taken from other aircraft in flight. Air-to-air photography requires 2 very skilled pilots, much pre-planning for safety. I could make an entire video of just that, but suffice it to say, talk to the pilots ahead of time so they understand just what it is that you are after for the image so that they can coordinate between the 2 on just how to get you into the right position, keep each other in sight, and be safe. I am so very blessed to have many pilot friends who are willing to go the extra mile, like allowing me to bungee cord a 2x4 on the strut of their plane to get some unique angle. That's one thing photography is all about for me, a unique image that no one else has or maybe has even thought of. This is taking aerial photography to the next level for me. Lastly, if it's an option you can afford, certainly book a custom aerial photo tour where you have control over the window being open or the door off, or where you can direct just where the pilot flies, how high, how fast, and potentially where you can go around and get the shot again if you missed it. If you do a custom flight, or even just have a pilot willing to put you into a good position to help you make good images, you need to be able to describe to the pilot just what you want. It's honestly not as easy as you think to not only explain to the pilot where you want to be, but even harder for the pilot to maneuver the aircraft as you wish. Talk over your plans with the pilot ahead of time so he understands just where you want the window you are shooting out of to be in relation to your subject, not where you want the plane to be. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, I'd very much appreciate it if you would subscribe and like. And thanks so much for your support.